I have a great honour of inviting up to the stage a friend of mine now, who I've known now since 2000, and I'm going to say 2015, when the Asia Pacific Conference was in Melbourne. I first met John, and John spoke about his experiences in New Zealand. He completed his thesis in 2018, supporting adults who have Prader-Willi syndrome, a caregiver's perspective on ethical and practical dilemmas, which is fantastic. John currently works as a behaviour specialist for Community Connections in New Zealand, and it's a community-based organisation providing supported living and residential service for people with PWS. So we'll take it away, John.
Thanks, Neil. I had an interesting experience at work just not long ago, and I'll be really interested to see if you can relate to what happened to me. Long story short, I found myself suddenly in the middle of a very intense argument that happened really quickly. And I wasn't quite sure how I got there. And it was an argument with a woman, we'll call her Mihi, it's not her name, but... and it was an argument with a woman who was very intelligent and who I've known for years, literally for years. And I was there visiting her because she and I had been meeting regularly. Welcome, guys, come in. Mihi and I had been meeting regularly to discuss her emotional regulation, ironically. And yet, honestly, I said one thing wrong. And then suddenly Mihi was filled with rage, and she ordered me off the property. And I was so dumb and so surprised that I didn't go straight away. But eventually I did, and as I was driving down the hill, Mihi phoned me. There was a message on my phone. And so I pulled over and picked up the message, and I'm thinking, oh, thank goodness, normal service has been resumed. She's calmed down a bit, she's got herself back, and she's phoning to sort this out. And of course, the message said, don't you ever come back to my fucking house, you bastard. As I say, now, so as I sat there on the side of the road, I thought two things as I began to regulate my own emotions. I thought, number one, how could I have been so dumb? I realised a number of mistakes I had made that afternoon, and I'd made them because I had become complacent because things had been going so well with me for so long. I had been vague about the time I was going to arrive, and I had essentially just dropped in. Now, he's not a person who copes well with surprises. I'd chosen a time when, unbeknownst to me, she'd already had an important appointment that had caused her quite a lot of stress, so she was in fact exhausted. And when I'd got there, she had begun to complain about some members of her staff team, and I had, big mistake, I had contradicted her. Yeah, now I see some heads nodding. Does this sound like a familiar experience? Yeah. The second thing that I thought as I sat there in my car was, why do I feel so bad? As you've guessed, Mihi has Prader-Willi syndrome. She's lovely, engaging, very capable. But after that, but I know that intense arguments and disagreements are par for the course. They're part of the deal if I'm supporting Mihi and people with her needs. Does that make some sense? And I thought, for goodness sake, you're a grown man. And, none of us like to tell horror stories, but not Mihi, but I support some people who sometimes try to assault me physically. And even one or two people who could really seriously hurt me. I was never in physical danger with me. And I sat there just reflecting. I thought, I feel like I've been punched in the stomach. And I did, all the way back to my office. And I thought to myself, why is this so tough? And finally, perhaps a third thing that I thought as I got back to my office is that actually the only people who are likely to understand why I feel so bad, why this is so tough, are in fact other caregivers who support family and paid caregivers who support people with Prader-Willi. People who understand this surprise that I had and this sense of dissonance, the sense of the world not quite making sense, and the incredible intensity of Mihi's anger that was directed to me at that time. So I thought to myself, this would make a great teaching story. Just before we go any further, this is me. And there is my email address. I haven't included references for this morning, but if there's anything here that you're interested in, please send me an email and I'll send you links. Fair enough? I've known, it was about 30 years ago that I met my first person with Prader-Willi syndrome, and that I watched somebody else get into their first intractable argument. And I've kind of been hooked ever since. I think that we, as caregivers, are very important people. As Neil said, we are the unsung heroes at this conference. We listened to our colleagues from the scientific stream talking yesterday. There's nothing like listening to a geneticist for half an hour to make you feel, question your life choices. Mate, I was sitting with Cindy and Joe there, and I was just thinking they were nodding, and I thought, well, I heard good morning. That was good. After that, not so much. However, can I point out that the standard international consensus for how best to support people with Prader-Willi syndrome did not come from our scientific peers? Yeah, it came from two places. Two places, interestingly, that are often the same. First, it came from families, and then it came from paid caregivers who said, listen, guys, this is what works, and it's controlling the food. What we do, we figured that out. And particularly pioneering families, and often pioneering families who went on to also be paid caregivers. Fair enough? So we are the unsung journey. If anybody, if you're of a bit of a mystical bent, Jung wrote some wonderful stuff about a thing called the hero's journey, a kind of archetypal view of some ways in which many stories that are told around the world are the same. Read a bit of Jung, think about the hero's journey, think about The Lord of the Rings or your favourite movie or whatever, and think about your experience beginning to work with someone with Prader-Willi. There are parallels. I also think, this is, if you like, this is the conclusion that we're giving up front. Conclusion first, where I'd like to get to. I think it is very important that we unsung heroes get to talk to each other. It's very important because we are, because nobody else quite understands, and we are an enormous resource for problem solving. The greatest resource is here in this room. We're also a great resource for mutual support, and we're a phenomenal resource for advancing the field. New practical ideas are very likely to come from us. Fair enough? So it's very important that we talk to each other. It was interesting, yesterday there were a couple of times where our scientist colleagues doing wonderful work, presenting wonderful stuff, and I counted 3 times where I thought to myself, it's really interesting that there is evidence for that now. Caregivers have been telling me this for a while. Yeah. So, finally, I think it's especially important for us to talk, when we talk together, to share our stories. It's my belief, my opinion, that just like our scientific colleagues publish papers and have journals and gatherings like this where they communicate with each other in their own scientific language, I think our work stories are often like those journal articles. And the story I shared around Mihi, we won't in the interest of time do that, but you know, I would love to hear your views on how I should proceed in supporting Mihi. Does that make some sense? I would also love to hear, if you've been in similar situations, what worked and what didn't work. Do you see what I mean? I think our work stories are vital tools for solving problems and advancing the field. But to do that, we have to be speaking to each other. So, what is Prader-Willi syndrome? I'm sorry guys, got a bit confused there. Can we take this as read? Awesome, thank you. Consequences of Prader-Willi syndrome. How about this one? Yep. Grant, can I just point out a wonderful article, 2013, by Barbara Whitman, in which she coins the term the Prader-Willi personality. And she makes the two wonderful points. First, that many features of the Prader-Willi syndrome personality are wonderfully pro-social. And many of the people we support, they're great conversationalists. Excuse me. They're great fun to have around. They're often very social and very caring. Yeah? The other thing Whitman points out is that the Prader-Willi personality is also a mass of contradictions. And in particular, it features a cognitive profile, a profile of your brain's abilities that features an unusual pattern or several unusual patterns of strengths and weaknesses. And that lays little traps for us in our work. So, what challenges do caregivers face? Well, as soon as I ask this question, you can hear the answer. It's the food, stupid. What challenges would you... Well, it's the risk of supporting someone who is literally, at life-threatening risk of overeating and facing either imminent serious injury or death or slower serious injury or death as the result of obesity. So, it's the food, stupid. In fact, it's not. In 2018, I finished a couple of studies that constituted my doctoral thesis, and among those two jobs that I really did in those studies, the first was an attempt, and it really was only an attempt, at a population survey across New Zealand of all the adults with Prader-Willi syndrome and the services they were receiving. And I conducted interviews with caregivers, first in groups and then with individuals. And in particular, I asked them questions about how have you addressed the ethical and practical challenges that come with supporting someone with Prader-Willi. And I was enormously interested in the things that they told me. The first thing is that caregivers all universally defined their work, even when they loved it, and lots of them did love it. And passing, just as Damien and I were saying just before we started, they also loved talking about it. Especially when they found someone else who, when we shared some experience. But they defined their work in terms of challenge. What they talked about was stress, but also the variety of challenges that they faced. For them, that was what the work was. It was challenge. And they talked about challenge not just in terms of food, but they talked about challenges coming from multiple sources. And on the one hand, challenge being unrelenting. So every single day you come to work, you have to be on your game. You have to make sure you've locked or unlocked. You have to say the right thing and not the wrong thing. You have to have checked A, B and C. Unrelenting. But also, they describe at the same time the challenge as dynamic. So like a contradiction, and it's dynamic because you never know what wonderfully creative thing the person with Prader-Willi may come up with this morning. And also because we work in the community where there is an infinite number of things that can go wrong. And Trent, do you mind if I steal your thunder and share your story? Chair, we're also just talking this morning, and Trent was talking about building planning to establish a specialist home for someone, and having the smarts to check online and discover that planning permission had been given to build a new McDonald's 200 metres away from the house, the garden of the house. You could have seen the big M over there. So we work in the community. There's an infinite number of things that can go wrong. So, do you see what I mean? Caregivers talk about the work in terms of challenge, and the source of the challenge is not just food. It comes from multiple sources, and it is unrelenting. It's ever present. It's always the same, and it's always different. It's dynamic and changing at the same time. So, caregivers also described a challenge that was really not directly to do with the food or the person with Prader-Willi at all. Caregivers universally described being accountable to multiple bosses, not just the person who pays my wages, but also to my colleagues, to the family of the person who has Prader-Willi, sometimes to families of other people who live in the home who don't have Prader-Willi, to the police when they turn up to ask why I've allowed the person I support to forage in rubbish bins or to steal from a supermarket. Even to my colleagues who work in generic disability services who think that I'm being authoritarian and much too tough. Again, is this ringing some bells? Yeah. So, challenge arising from multiple sources. Caregivers also described isolation, even in the context of disability services. But really, when it came to describing the challenges they faced, there was one simple theme. It's interesting because Dr. Singh also raised this yesterday when he gave his presentation. The greatest challenges that caregivers face are to do with behaviour. And much of that behaviour is around food, but not all of it. Fair enough? Grand. And look, I would love to go into some details here, but I'll move on. In the interest of time, these behaviours are mostly, not all, but they're mostly verbal. So why are they so tough? And there's good evidence that they are tough. I'm not a big fan of the term, but in the research literature, the term that is used is caregiver burden. And there's good evidence, starting with families, but also with paid caregivers, that the stress, the burden, if you like, of supporting someone with Prader-Willi is particularly significant. Some authors would say it is the most significant syndrome in this sense. Righto, fast and messy. But this is one of our conclusions, I think, the caregivers and I talking together. I'll give you a second to read that. We coined this term relationship dissonance to describe the sense of surprise that I felt when I was talking to Mihi, and many caregivers described when they were talking about some challenges they'd faced. I had a very funny conversation with a woman who coordinated a team working in a house, and she said, we have a joke here, and the joke is, what conversation do you have with new caregivers after 3 months? And the conversation goes something like, how could she do that to me? We had an understanding. We agreed. Often, the capacity, even when we know them well, the person who has Prader-Willi has a capacity for surprising us, for surprising even me. I think this comes from a number of sources. The first is, I think we, especially we who are not family members, we, using our neurotypical brains, we often overestimate both the depth and the strength of the relationship that we form with people who have Prader-Willi. Does that make some sense? I have known Mihi for a long time, and everybody else I know in my life with whom I have that kind of relationship, well, actually, we can talk about conflicts where they arise. For Mihi, my relationship with her is every bit as strong. And however, much of her disability is hidden. And once Mihi becomes a tiny bit triggered, experiences a little bit of emotion, her ability to listen and to respond and to regulate her own feelings drops like a stone. Does that make some sense? So I think one reason it's such hard work, can be so stressful, is because we are often run the risk of being surprised, and one reason we are surprised often is because we overestimate we mistake the nature of our relationship. Part of that is to do with that unusual pattern of cognitive strengths or weaknesses. For example, there's good research to suggest, and I think good experience, people with Prader-Willi tend to be very poor at task switching. So I really don't do surprises. And even though the big dumb psychologist knows Mihi well, dropping in was never smart. Yeah? Second thing, they are very prone to stress associated with cues around food, and they are very, very good often at noticing detail, particularly visual detail. So, for example, I often recall the story of a caregiver who brought a chocolate bar, a half-eaten chocolate bar to work in her bag. And again, she should have known different. And she went to put her bag in the staff room, in the sleepover room. And as she did, she put it down on the table, and the open wrapper of the half chocolate bar was noticed by the person with Prader-Willi. And we got away with it. There was no incident. However, every single time that caregiver turned up and greeted the person with Prader-Willi for at least a year, I don't know how long, but every time the caregiver told me that the person with Prader-Willi, you got the bag? Is the bag there? And every time the bag was there, is there chocolate on there? Again, does this make some sense? And you know, even though things are calm, and while that's happening, the person's cortisol and adrenaline are raised, and they're on a hair trigger, and the risk of emotional dysregulation or other challenging behaviour is elevated. None of us think well and make our best decisions when we're emotional. For most people I know who have Prader-Willi, that effect is on steroids. Drops like a stone. And for me, it's almost become diagnostic. I suspect someone has Prader-Willi. If ever I find myself in an argument with someone and I struggle to get out, no matter what I say, and also I get that sense that the person is saying things that they know would be ridiculous when they were in their wise mind, when they're calm again. Does this make some sense? Yeah. How am I doing for time, Nick? Oh, mate. Oh, well, in that case. I remember once in my youth watching a very helpful training video that was in fact a Monty Python sketch. And apologies to you all, this is showing my age, so, indulge me. John Cleese and Michael Palin, you may have heard of them, but the sketch began with Michael Palin knocking on a door, an office door, opening it and saying, "Is this the right room for an argument?" And Cleese said, "Yes, it is. Would you like the 5-minute argument or the half hour, the 30-minute argument?" And he says, I'll just have the 5-minute argument, thanks. And he pays for 5 minutes of arguing. Sits down, big smile, have an argument. And so they have this argument. But Palin finds it quite frustrating because everything he says, Cleese just contradicts him. So, he said, "I paid for 5 minutes." He said, "No, you didn't." And eventually Palin gets really frustrated with him and he says, "Look, this is not a proper argument." To which Cleese replies, "Yes, it is." And then Palin says, "An argument is a series of statements linked together in order to establish a proposition." And Cleese, "So I can prove this is not a proper argument." And Cleese says, "No, it's not." So, my point here, one reason I think this is so stressful, and I think almost diagnostic for people with Prader-Willi, is this tendency to slip into these kinds of interactions that seem like arguments, but really you're the only person arguing. The person with Prader-Willi isn't even processing what you're saying to any depth. They're just contradicting you. They're keeping themselves safe and maintaining some power because, in fact, much of their brain has stopped working at this sense. So, what helps? Well, someone very wise has said that psychology is the scientific statement of the bleeding obvious. And I think it was meticulous scientific statement of the bleeding obvious. But there are elements here of the bleeding obvious. One thing that absolutely helps is having a plan, because we're supporting people who struggle with surprise and who are at their best when they know what's coming and they're able to deal with it in good time. Fair enough? Like that, related to that, is consistency and teamwork. The caregivers I spoke to in my research were very, very clear. It didn't actually matter very much how good or how effective individual team members were, because you couldn't work all the shifts. And also that if there was one member of the team who didn't follow the plan and was inconsistent, effectively that was a deal breaker, and really that person couldn't be on the team. Several people also made the point that it wasn't necessarily that person's own shift. That inconsistency would result in problems, perhaps incidents, perhaps conflict. They wouldn't necessarily arise on that person's own shift. Thirdly, what helps, g'day, come in guys. Thirdly, what helps is mutual support. It's having a community. These days I like to think of it as a community of practice, a professional community. who understand the challenges we face, with whom we can share stories of our victories and our successes, and also commiserate and plan about the challenges we face. And finally, I'd just like to take a minute to talk about us sharing our stories. There's a wonderful piece of research that I've borrowed from the nursing studies literature in the UK by Abma and her colleagues. And in it, she interviewed a group of caregivers who were nurses who had the task of supporting people with intellectual disability who had offended sexually. So, a bit like supporting someone with Prader-Willi, these were nurses who were faced every day with ethical and practical problems that they had to address and solve. And ABMA came to some conclusions that I saw absolutely replicated when I talked to caregivers of people with Prader-Willi. Come in. No worries. When caregivers, either ABMA's nurses or the caregivers I talked to, when they were faced with a difficult problem, what are we going to do about this opportunity? Or how are we going to fix this problem, address this issue? It was notable that the caregivers I talked to, none of them referred to the code of practice and policy that was issued by their agency. Not one. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody talked to me about guidelines set by the New Zealand Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. Sorry, guys. Nobody quoted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons. No one mentioned any ethical or political or religious text. When it came to solving really difficult issues and people were together in a staff meeting, what they did was tell stories. They said, well, this is a difficult situation, but I was in such and such and we did this and this is what happened. And because they were within a group that understood the sort of secret language of the story, just like you did with Mihi. You knew, when I told my story about Mihi, you know what those kinds of arguments are like, or at least many of you do, don't you? Okay, because these guys had that shared knowledge, the story carried a great deal more meaning and complexity than just the surface value of the words. Does that make sense? And secondly, it was noticed that often, after somebody had told a story as a way of making a suggestion, other caregivers, other staff would respond with a counter story. Yes, and. Oh, that's a good idea. So it'll be, yeah, that's, well, I did da-da-da-da-da. Or maybe, yes, but. Or I take your point, but remember what happened when. Again, does this make some sense? I think our work stories, and I think there is an analogy here, with the scientific papers that are published by our scientific colleagues, I think our work stories are like a kind of secret language that we have the chance to decode, and they're a sort of shortcut whereby we can have the conversations that we need to have that will help us support each other, support the people we care for, and advance the field. So, that's my. That's why I'm so excited about today. And I hope as we go through the day, please do feel free to contribute. You're all terribly quiet. I can only think it's an Australian thing. But can I encourage you, please do feel free to participate and please share your stories. Can I just make one, before we go ahead and do that, can I just make 2 points? First, can we agree, including people who might be watching this online, that we're a confidential group? Fair enough? So we're sharing stories, but the meaning of these stories are more likely to be understood by other caregivers who have an understanding of the syndrome, and they may not travel well. Fair enough? Awesome. The second thing is, as part of that, My suggestion is, you're all grown-ups, you make your own decisions, but my suggestion is change identifying details. I certainly have in my story about Mihi. Again, does that make some sense? Cheers. Well, can I say, I am hugely excited to meet you all, and I really do hope we get some good time to talk before the day is over. But can I just finish my story about Mihi? I have a wonderful advantage in my work, which is that I'm married to another person who is also the caregiver of someone who has Prader-Willi. So I went home and I said, you know, my wife Christine said, well, how was your day? And I just shared some details and just said, I feel awful. I don't know why, it's not stupid, I feel awful. And we had a cup of coffee and a laugh about it, and I felt better. Okay, fair enough. About a week later, I had another call from Mihi. She's still a bit angry with me, but she was very, very keen to tell me about the appalling behaviour of another staff person. I think we're probably going to be all right. Cheers, thanks.